Hey guys, my name is Shreyas and welcome to Simple Biology. In this video, we're going to be talking about speciation. So, what is speciation? Speciation is basically the process of one species splitting into two or more species. So it's basically how are species created. That's what speciation is. And it creates a diversity in life. We've been talking a lot about the diversity in life. When we talk about Charles Darwin, we mentioned how we talked about the unity of life, the diversity of life, and there were three conjectures. So basically, the diversity in life describes how there's many organisms, and life is just so vast. There's little things from little bacteria all the way to huge things like a blue whale. So speciation shows how there's a diversity in life. It also shows how organisms share a common ancestor, which basically means that all the life we see on Earth today all came from one organism, and how this one organism, this one species, has branched out into all the species we see today. It also forms a bridge between microevolution and macroevolution. As a review, let's recap on what microevolution and macroevolution is. Microevolution is the changes over time within a population, while macroevolution is changes over time above the species level. So even before we talk about speciation, let's first think about what is a species. So scientists have many different definitions for species, which we're going to be looking at a little later. But the one that we go with in AP Biology is called the biological species concept. So what is that? The biological species concept defines a species as a population whose members have the potential to produce offspring with each other, but not with members of other groups. So basically what this is saying is that if two members of a population can mate and reproduce, they are considered part of the same species. So humans belong to the same species because any human can mate with any other human. So they're part of the same species. Now, it's important to realize that species genetically resemble each other due to gene flow, which means that they have basically, when we talk about their genes, the information within the organism which codes for all the proteins, all the interesting stuff. So species genetically resemble each other because they have very similar genetic information due to gene flow. Now, we've been talking about gene flow, but just as a review, remember that gene flow is a transfer of alleles between a population. Okay, so that's basically saying, when you have two populations, let's say you have population A and you have population B, whenever you see organisms within those two populations reproducing with each other, that is called gene flow because genes are being shared, genetic information is being shared between those two populations. So species genetically resemble each other due to gene flow. What this is saying is that because of this transfer of genetic information, organisms within populations belong to the same species. So when you cut off that gene flow, whenever you cut off the transfer of alleles, that's when you get the results of new species. Very important point here is the absence of gene flow results in the formation of new species. Make sure you know this, okay? So here are a few examples of fish species. They're all fish, but this bluefish can't mate with this gray fish here because they can't mate, the bluefish is a different species than the gray fish. Okay. So that's the definition of the species that we go with, but it's also important to remember that there's different definitions that scientists use. Okay, this is not really critical, but I just want to talk about this, that sometimes scientists define species using different definitions. The morphological species concept, for example, says that organisms of a population belong to the same species whenever they have the same body shape and structural features. The ecological species concept defines a species in relationship to their ecological niche. And the phylogenetic species concept talks about how a species is the smallest group of individuals from a common ancestor. We have two videos on phylogenetic trees, which you might want to refer to. This will probably make more sense here. Okay. So it's just what I want you to take from this is just know that there's different definitions for species, but the one we go with is the biological species concept. Now there's different types of speciation. Let's first talk about, there's actually two, allopatric speciation and sympatric speciation. So let's first talk about what allopatric speciation is. Allopatric speciation is when a population becomes separated by a physical barrier, okay? This can also be known as geographic speciation or other country speciation. And what it does is it creates an interruption in gene flow. And remember, again, from this slide, I said that species are formed whenever you have an absence of gene flow. Very important to you that you know that. Let's have a few examples here. So one example is the overflowing of a lake results in two or more smaller lakes which separate populations. Another example is a river dividing a population of animals that cannot cross it. Okay, so if you look here, I have a picture here. So let's say you had a population of deer, and you also had a population, I don't know if that's a deer. I think that might be caribou, whatever it is. So you have a population of this organism, and then you also have a population of elephants. And then what happens is, let's say there's this huge flood which comes and brings this river which separates the population off. So now there is a cut of gene flow because the organisms on the left side of the river can't reproduce with the organisms on the right side of the river. So there is no transfer of genetic information between both. There is essentially no gene flow. So what happens is whenever you have that cut off of gene flow, there's no more gene flow, you get two different species. Eventually, let's say with these two organisms will start reproducing with each other, not the elephant and the deer, but I'm saying that like this deer and this deer will reproduce with each other, and with time, these organisms will form, on the left side of the lake will form a different species from the organisms on the right, because what happens is with time, the genes that these organisms have on the left side are going to change to a point where they can't reproduce with the organisms on the right side. Okay, so you'll start to get two different populations. So, and this is allopatric speciation because, not two different populations, two different species. And this is allopatric speciation because you have a physical barrier. This river is creating a physical barrier which is cutting off gene flow. In contrast to that, you can have sympatric speciation. Okay, so sympatric speciation is when populations of the same species and habitat become reproductively isolated from each other. So this is different than allopatric speciation because in allopatric speciation you have this reproductive isolation. Reproductive isolation is basically saying the organisms can't reproduce with each other because of a physical barrier. In sympatric speciation, there is no physical barrier. That the barrier is coming from something else than a physical barrier. Another name for sympatric speciation is same country speciation, and is way less common than allopatric speciation because in allopatric speciation you have a physical barrier. In sympatric speciation you don't have a physical barrier. So there's other factors which play a role in this, and they're less common. Okay, and just like allopatric speciation, sympatric speciation occurs when causes gene flow to be reduced. It can be formed by many different factors. Polyploidy. So these are examples of sympatric speciation. Polyploidy. Polyploidy is a subject which is not tested by the college board, so I'm not going to really review over it, but you can go research that on your own. But it can be caused, examples of sympatric speciation, polyploidy, sexual selection, and habitat differentiation I am going to be discussing. So sexual selection is when it's selection based off a preference by one sex for certain characteristics in individuals over the other sex. Okay, this is basically saying, like, let's say you have a I don't know, let's say you have this organism here. I think this is a ram. So what will happen is whenever the male rams want to mate with the female rams, the male rams will start to compete with each other, okay? And the one that is most dominant is the one that will get the right to mate with the female. Okay, so that's sexual selection. Okay, because there's the selection based off a preference for one sex over the other, based on characteristics. So that's an example of sympatric speciation because you're seeing this isolation, you're seeing this separation of organisms becoming reproductively isolated by a factor which is not like the allopatric speciation where you have a barrier, a physical barrier. These organisms are being reproductively isolated because of something else, because of this sexual selection. Okay. Another example of sympatric speciation is habitat differentiation. So this is when a population uses a habitat or resource not used by the parent population, and mutations allow individuals to exploit different conditions of the same environment. Okay, so this is basically like they're all in the same habitat, but a sect of the population has this mutation or something like that, and it starts to utilize a resource within the habitat, within the whole habitat, and because of that, they start to not want to mate with each other, and that causes that's an example of sympatric speciation. So there's no physical barrier, but a factor within the habitat is going to cause them to not want to mate with each other. Okay, and that's going to cause that reproductive isolation, and therefore it's sympatric speciation. Okay, so just as a recap, allopatric speciation is when a population becomes separated by a physical barrier, and in sympatric examples, it causes a interruption in gene flow. Reproductive isolation is another term for this. Okay, and that's basically many barriers restricting reproduction. And in contrast to that, you have sympatric speciation, also when populations of the same species sharing the same habitat become reproductively isolated from each other. So here there is no physical barrier, and different types of sympatric speciation are polyploidy, sexual selection, and habitat differentiation. We're going to be talking about even more examples of sympatric speciation in the next video when we talk about, in that video we're going to be talking about more on the reproductive isolation and how that works. So stay tuned, but make sure you know this. That's all you have to know for now. Speciation is as simple as that.